to style text, we first need to create a sample text that we can use to style. And we use some placeholder tags right here and save the website. And inside of our style.css, we can select this text now by using the P selector, for example. And first of all, let's say we want to change the color of our text. And we can do so by using the color attribute. And right here, you can basically select any color by just typing the name, for example. And the second option to change the color would actually be selecting a hash code, for example. So you could, for example, say use hashtag FFF, for example, which is white. Or you can say, let's use 000, which is black, for example. But you can also obviously define the hash code by using any other color, or you can hover over this color picker right here and just select a different color code and save the document. And right here, you can basically see the chosen color right now. So you can either use the name, or you can use the hash code to define the color. And the third option would be using RGB values by typing RGB. And inside of here, you can select the portion of red, the portion of green, and the portion of blue you want to have. And that scale goes from 0 to 255. The higher the value, the higher the portion of red we'll basically use. So if we say, for example, we want to use 250 of red, 0 of green, and 0 of blue, we get a red text. If we say we want to have a portion of 0 red and 255 of green, for example, we get green text. And the same obviously works for blue. So if we say 0 green, 0 red, and 255 blue, we get a blue text. And obviously we can also mix those two colors. So we could say we want to have 100 of green, for example, and you see the text change slightly. Now we can say we want to have 255 of red, for example, and we get a different color as well. So by using RGB, you basically say which portion of which color do you want to use to create a new color. Because in the end, every color is obviously made up of different colors, and by mixing colors, you generate a new color. And red, green, and blue are basically the base colors. So if you have 255 for each of those values, you get white. If you have 0 for all of those values, you'll get black. Now there's basically an extension to RGB, if you want to say so, by using RGBA. And if you use RGBA, you also have the alpha channel, which means you can also set the transparency. If I say, for example, that I want a transparency of 0.6, you see that the text is slightly transparent now. I can also say that I want to have a transparency of 0.1, which means the text is almost fully transparent. And the scale of transparency goes from 0, which means it's fully transparent, so it's invisible to the user, to 1, which means it's fully visible. The next thing you can do is basically change the font family. So we can use font minus family to define a font family. Now we have some base fonts that we can choose from. So we could, for example, say we want to use impact, and we'd save the file. And as you can see, we basically have a different font right now. To change the font size, we can use the font minus size property. We'll save that. And now we can, for example, say that we want to use 16 pixels for our font size, which is basically the base font size. So nothing is really changing. But if we say we want to have 26 pixels, for example, we see that our font is a lot bigger now. To change the thickness of our font, we use the font weight property by using font minus weight. And right here you can see different values. 400 is basically standard, so nothing will change. 600 should also be a little bit bolder. 700 is actually even bolder. And right here we also can use bold, bolder, lighter, normal, and so on. So 400 is usually normal, and just feel free to experiment with those values a little bit. And you can also use names like bold to define a bold font, normal to define a normal font size basically, and lighter to define a lighter version, which does not exist for this type of font family. So we are going to delete this font family so you can see the difference a little bit better. And not every font supports all types of styles. So basically, if you have a font that does not support light, for example, then you just have the normal version of the font. But this would be the way to do it if the font supports different styles. You can use the text align property to align the text to the center, to the left, to the right, and so on. So let's say we want to center our text. We can just do so by using the center property. And if you use Visual Studio Code, you'll see basically an indication once you type a colon of what is possible anyways. So you could obviously center, left, right, and so on. We want to go to the right, for example, we save our file, and now our font is at the right. Text decoration might be useful in some cases for you as well. You can basically define whether your text should be underlined, dotted, have a line through, and so on. So this is basically some additional styling, if you want to say so. So let's say we want to have an underline because that is something that is really common. And once you save, the document, you see that your text is underlined now. So yeah, you could also say we want to have a line through, for example. Now you have a line going through your text, which might not be the most common use case, but maybe you want to have that, and so on. So just experiment with that as well, and you'll see how it goes. So let's just delete those styles for the next styles, and let's create a text that is slightly longer by adding some characters or some words. And now we can add a line height, for example, which basically just is what it says. It basically just defines the height between your lines. So we can say that we want to have a line height of, for example, 30 pixels. And now, as you can see, the space between the lines is slightly bigger. The next option we have is the letter spacing, which again is just the spacing between the letters. So we can say we want to have a letter spacing of 30 pixels, for example, and now we have a pretty big letter spacing, which might be way too big, but in some cases you might want to have text like this, for example, since you think it's pretty cool or whatever.